All right, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, salatu wassalamu ala ashraf al-mursaleen, Sayyidina Muhammad wa alihi wa sahbihi ajma'een. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to the second session, which is titled Risky Business. It'll be quite difficult to follow the show that we just had earlier on in the first session, but hopefully with my interesting panelists, we're going to be able to provide a unique perspective on Oman and the opportunities as well. So allow me to welcome His Excellency Engineer Saeed Al-Mawali, Minister of Transport, Communication and Information Technology. Your Excellency, please join me on stage. I would also invite His Excellency Azzan Al-Busaidi, Undersecretary for Ministry of Heritage, Tourism and Chairman of OMRAN. And I'd also have the pleasure of having Mr. Crayon Butler to join us as well on the stage. All right, so we've had a very interesting first session where we're exploring some of the challenges and the unpredictabilities. All right, so Professor Diana Mangalaju, all right, who is a professor at Saeed Business School, University of Oxford. And allow me, I haven't given the proper introductions for my colleagues here. So, we're always going to have those conversations, inshallah, after. So, Professor, welcome as well. It's great to have you with us. Right, so risky business. Given what we've heard in the earlier session about some of the challenges, I'm looking to kind of take a deep dive into understanding how Oman is managing those challenges, as well as looking at some international perspectives on what are the kind of things that we need to be looking at while we're managing risk. All right, again, just a reminder, please, if we could kindly pay attention to us at the panel for our distinguished panelists. So let me start with Your Excellency and kind of bring us a little bit closer to what's happening in Oman in terms of the infrastructure, how Oman is positioning itself, kind of making that long bet, if we may, whether we're looking at the hard infrastructure that we've invested in, ports, airports, and whatnot, the digital infrastructure that Oman is using as a transformational sort of path towards the future, whether it's in laying out fiber optics, connecting to the rest of the world, but also, more interestingly, Oman has been dabbling with aerospace and space investments as well. So how about a perspective for our guests from out of Oman to understand what is the roadmap and where we're headed?
Okay. Well, first, thank you very much for having me here. I'll just run quickly through the global trends and then zoom in.
By all means.
How do we do business in Oman and what matters for the country at the moment, and by extension, of course, for the region. There are a few things that are very clear. There is a rechange or a new trends, a few trends in the economy that are going to shape the future to come. IT and anything related to IT, AI, etc., continuing to become basically a devastation for the usual businesses. So industries that are becoming older faster because of the advancements and the fast pace of the IT and the IT sphere. Then you have also the economy related to that. In fact, the services that comes out of that, the developments that we need, there is a divide as a result in the world related to how fast countries are catching up compared to countries that are innovative in these spheres, and of course delivering good value for their citizens, but also good value for the world. So a lot of catching up for some countries, good pace for some are ahead of the curve, and some are trying to do something that was 2 years ago important, and suddenly there's something more important than it. Additionally, this divide in the economy. There is a clear migration of economy globally. The economy is moving, shifting, becoming stronger in some regions. There is more importance to the South. The South at some stage will have about 40% of all young people, actually by the year 2050 or something like this. That's very close. That's not very far from now. So you need to think about all of these things, and you need to also draw your plans according to that. Also, there are things to do.
In the interest of time, because I know your time is limited with us on this panel, How's that affecting Oman,
Good.
and how are we managing that?
Right. So the last thing that I also want to talk about, sorry, before I go into what we can do, there are things to do with sovereignty related to technology that we need to pay attention to as well. That's very important. In Oman, what we need to do is make sure that we are ready for this, both from the hardware, the hard infrastructure and the soft infrastructure. If you look at the connectivity logistics, we need to do more of what we've done very well in the past, and that's ports, etc., and how efficient are our ports, how connected, etc. The roads, which we've done very well, and we continue to do very well. So we've always been the top 10 countries when it comes to quality of roads, etc., etc. We need to sweat these assets, connect them better, and sweat them. So the roads, ports, airports, etc. We are doing the same as well when it comes to IT. In this whole region, Oman is second to Djibouti in terms of subsea cables connectivity in this region, from the African Horn all the way to the Gulf, basically. So we need to capitalize on that. We also need to capitalize on the fact that the world is trending towards, all of anything to do with data processing. Data needs to go green, because more and more this is becoming prominent in terms of the consumption of power. And we have an opportunity, because there will be an acceleration in the consumption of power for these things, AI, normal data centers, etc. Now, we have to start now to make sure that this goes green. We don't want to come back later doing, and that's something that Oman definitely can offer, as well as the connectivity. And then finally, if I talk a little bit about space, the space and space economy in the Gulf is more or less very small compared to the normal share in an average country. Now, we have clear advantages in Oman, and that's why we are doing what we are doing. The location that we've given to an investor to launch from is a location where basically it's in the right distance from the equator. The closer to the equator you are, the more advantage you have. The degrees available for launch towards east is also one of, I think it's, from what I understand, it's the second best place on earth as well. And finally, the ability to and the capacity in Oman and the Gulf in terms of the downstream industry which will connect to this is very wide. There is a lot that we can do. We import a lot of these downstream industries, and it is a big possibility that we can start something and start it big.
Essentially, there will be connectivity. And we'll come back perhaps to some of those technicalities. Your Excellency, Azzan, welcome back. I haven't been in a panel with you for a while now, yes. So it's good to see you.
Happy to be here.
By the way, His Excellency was a colleague of mine when we were in the undergraduate studies as well. Your Excellency, you're on a completely different boat, if I may use that anecdote, and you're looking at tourism. And we've heard from His Excellency Qais how tourism is central as one of the key sectors in Oman. And for our visitors from out of Oman, you might have sensed some of the sort of impact tourism could have on a place like Oman, whether it's the location, whether it's the services. And we're one of the infrastructure that you've been working on through collaborations with investors. So when I think of Oman, I think an experience, not just a location that we want to visit. How do you see the positioning of Oman in a very competitive world? The bets that we're making today on that tourism infrastructure, is that a winning card for Oman from your perspective and from your experience?
Well, first of all, thank you. Glad to be here on this panel. Highness, Your Excellency. Before I start, I wish all of our guests are enjoying their time here in Oman. They're very much welcomed. And to answer your point, yes, I think we do. The very essence of the way we portray tourism is that it's an authentic experience, very diverse, making use of the infrastructure that's in place, and most importantly is focusing on experiences rather than focusing on the traditional approach of tourism. I think today we do have the infrastructure that would enable us to promote experiences in Oman, and currently the organizations involved in the tourism sector are working together in order to enhance this offering, whether it's in adventure tourism, ecotourism, or even luxury segment. And
so, Your Excellency, where would you place Oman? Because we've heard His Excellency also mention we need to make choices, and some of those choices are to mitigate some risks, but then we have the broader strategy, the vision, and whatnot. So on that needle, adventure, is it exclusive? Is it inclusive? Is it family? Where would you likely put Oman, or is it a difficult thing to do?
See, the risks that are facing the tourism sector are the risks that are facing any other economic sector around the world. They're either climate risks, cybersecurity risks, economic risks, and to an extent, the risk of over-tourism, which perhaps Oman is in a good position as we speak, with the numbers, with the value that is created, but we could end up becoming at risk of that if plans are not taken into consideration at this present time in order to mitigate these risks. I would say that it's a country that provides, once again, an exclusive tourism experience rather than a product. And it should not mean that we are just focusing on the luxury segment. I think today we are seeing through the numbers that the age group of travelers to Oman is becoming younger. The numbers as well suggest that we have people who are seeking authentic experiences, cultural experiences, rather than just a place to vacate on the beach. And that's basically it.
And I'm going to come back to those experiences as well, because there's something also of a challenge and a risk as well in that. But, you know, we tend to think about risks, Creon, as just danger that we foresee, but there are definitely, what we've heard earlier as well, opportunities. And I want to focus on the idea of calculated risk. Most of us try to mitigate risk and avoid the worst. An insurance policy, if you like. But what's your take on calculated risk, and how might we think about that in Oman and the broader region as we think about where do we position ourselves?
Well, thank you, and thank you very much for inviting me. I'm one of those for whom this is the first time in Oman, so it's a pleasure to be
Welcome.
here. So I think, as you say, you can try and mitigate risks beforehand, but the problem with that is it can be very expensive, and you can forego various opportunities. The other thing is to take a particular strategy and then to adapt to whatever may come subsequently. I mean, just to take the situation in the UK, for example, there is a lot of effort now going into the UK to develop an industrial strategy. And there's a big question as to whether the government is going to stick to what is a traditional UK approach of essentially focusing on skills, on developing the research base, on infrastructure, or go more broadly by picking particular sectors. And I think the challenge is we know the first things work. What we don't know is among those second set of areas, what is going to work and what isn't going to work. And in particular, you know, if we're short of finances, indeed we are constrained on finance in the UK, what to do. I think in a bigger country you can afford, in a sense, to, if you like, leave the market to make those decisions, leave the private sector. In a smaller country like Oman, I think the government has to play a role and to take those decisions. Absolutely. And then the key issue there is to say, well, okay, I'm taking a risk. If something goes wrong, if the scenarios work out not as I expect, how then am I going to adapt to that? And I think that then enables you to take that step forward.
That kind of brings me to the connection with what we've heard about Oman Vision 2040 and the 5-year plans that are very specific and effectively sort of their industrial policies and where do we focus, and you know, whether it's logistics or whether it is tourism or any of the other sectors that we're interested in. Now, do you believe that those kind of long-term strategies and long-term visions are one way to think about taking that risk in a calculated manner?
Yes, I think if you are a smaller country, you have to make those choices. And then the thing to do is to, you know, have the necessary resources to see them through. I mean, in the earlier discussion, there was several points about the debt level. You know, if you have a sufficiently low and stable debt, then it gives you the resources to deal with whatever may come. And I know this is a big effort in Oman to improve the credit rating. So I think, yes, these are the right things for a smaller country to choose, and indeed, but you need the resources to follow them through should things turn out not as you expect.
Absolutely. Thanks for that. Professor, welcome back again, and I apologize for the mishap. I'd like to take your angle on what some might call psychological safety and how we train ourselves to think about risk-taking, as Creon had mentioned. But I'd like to challenge the view, we're not looking at a company, but we're looking at country Inc., so policymakers, leaders making those. How do we prepare such caliber and cadre to think in that approach? And is it doable? Is it something, is this forum one of those things that we're putting our head out there a little bit, answering the tough questions?
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me here. It's a great pleasure to be here.
Pleasure.
And, well, you know, we are in a session talking about risky business. Indeed. Everybody talks about, you know, how to be innovative, how to be calculating risk, etc. However, you know, we also talk, and that was also the previous session, about how basically you have different risk which are getting integrated, cascading at different time scales and so on. So the question is, well, I would say how basically you prepare in a way not for stability, but, you know, and I was hearing in the previous session saying, well, we are a kind of oasis of stability. Well, I think it's a pretty risky business to call it that way, because if you sell stability, what's happening when you don't have that stability anymore? So I'd say what's really important is to try to understand how to create a safety space, you know, and you are talking about this psychological safety, which makes it okay to function and basically work in a very uncertain environment. And I think this is true for companies, this is true for institutions, and definitely this is true also for countries. So, and it's really interesting because people talk about psychological safety and calculated risk in all kind of arena. But in the end, when you talk to innovators, for example, you know, everybody wants to innovate and take calculated risks. But when you know, 80+% of the leaders want to innovate or are welcoming, embracing, encouraging. When you ask the same leaders, are they happy with the way they or their organization innovate? It's single digits, you know, somewhere in between 5 and 10% that people say, well, actually I'm quite happy with the performance in terms of this. And this is due a lot with, you know, fears, because all of this provokes fears of uncertainty, fears of even careers, fears, even in, you know, in the public sector, not only in the company sectors. You have the questions of fear of criticism. So you have a number of spaces and dimensions of this fear, and to ensure this psychological safety, you have to address that in a way where this becomes possible, you know, to have something where mistake, you know, a mistake is not a mistake, it's a miss which you can take again. And then you are gonna, you know, say, okay, it's fine. And I think, you know, it's interesting to see when you have great leaders sharing failures in their journeys. And that's creating a sense of psychological safety to the environment in which they basically functions and manage.
Thanks for that, Professor. And I like the oasis of stability one. I'll come back to, but His Excellency wants to add something.
I would want to add, I totally agree with this point, Professor, and maybe I would just want us to stop for a minute and just think about Apollo 11 and what were their main ingredients when they took the risk.
You're spoiling my next transition to His Excellency.
I'm sorry, Your Excellency. No, just think about it. They only had 4 kilobytes of RAM and 74 kilobytes of ROM, and yet they took the faith of going into space back then. And I think today with all the resources that we have, we still can't find it easy to venture into, the area of making mistakes, because, it can cost a lot.
Absolutely. And that's something I want to talk a little bit more about. But if you allow me, Your Excellency, and please hold that thought,
Sure.
because I want it back. His Excellency has a commitment that he would need to address, so I want to pick his mind one more time, transitioning from the Apollo missions, and unfortunately there's also aerospace has been subject to a lot of challenges as well. But much of what we think about, knowledge economy, AI, aerospace, space, all of these involve a lot of risk. How is Oman positioning itself, from what we've heard earlier as well, beyond the strategies and beyond? What's on the piece of paper on your desk, for example, that says, listen, go or no go? We've got the countdown going, whether we're launching a satellite from Oman eventually, or whether we want to connect and have AI do more in Oman, so it's not just a paper with a policy. What are the things you're thinking about that some of our guests will think, hang on, that's something I want to connect with?
I think the most important thing to realize in anything, but more so in the changes that we need to bring about from the ministry to the rest of the country. We need to allow people, give them the space to take a leap of faith, and to allow them also to practice their tenacity. People are tenacious. They will try and try, and they will succeed. If 20 tries and one succeed, so be it. But we need to prepare the ground for this. We need to help them, support them through policies, sometimes even through incentives,
And
if needs be.
Your Excellency, if you may allow me, investors might think this is all good and well.
True.
We've heard it elsewhere. How would you enable someone who's interested in those areas, whether it's a data center, whether it's other types of connectivity or different types of mobility, which is within the mandate of the ministry, hydrogen mobility, autonomous mobility, manufacturing of different things in Oman that link to the broader logistical?
Yeah, so you have to be open to their requests, and you need to be fast in adapting your policies, your strategies. I'll give you one example. Google started their self-driving car almost 15 years ago, more than that. Today, there are only 2 places in the US where this car can be driven without a driver. 15 years later. In smaller countries like Oman, changing the policy is much faster. And allowing the tests, it's much faster. It took us about 2 months, for example, to change the policy for the autonomous aircrafts. And the quickest way to do it was to adapt the regulation that we have for drones to allow for that, even manned aircrafts. Also, you need to work with the private sector for this. You need to open it for them. You need to make it easy. You need to also expect that mistakes will happen. Some of them of a high magnitude, but it's worth it. Definitely it's worth it. If you succeed in 1 or 2 things, this is worth it. Again,
so,
also...
Your Excellency, are you going to see autonomous cars in Oman anytime soon?
Absolutely. Actually, we are going after a couple of companies.
Right.
And the same with autonomous aircraft.
Drones and...
Yes.
And whatnot.
Yes.
So, Excellency, before you leave us, is there anything you would like to add for our audience? Something...
Well, I'll come back. I'm leaving for about an hour and a half, and I'll come back. But Oman is open to business. Oman is also a place where you can do things faster, safer, and where you can also tap into a few resources, including the main ingredient here, and that's the ability of our people. We have some good qualified people in the country that are eager to work with any investors. Now, the other thing is, there are a lot of changes, time of great uncertainty at the moment, but stay focused. If this hesitation will get us nowhere.
Absolutely.
I think we have to stay focused on the goals individually as countries, organizations, or people.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I do apologize that I have to leave, but I'll come back.
All right. So His Excellency will be back later for further discussions, inshallah. Thank you, Excellency. So if you allow me now, we'll continue with our discussion because I've got a bit of a tough question for you, Your Excellency. Oman has one of the critical resources that we've heard about that we tend to talk a lot about, which is our heritage and our culture. And in the last 5 years, the Ministry of Tourism inherited that mandate. And it became the Ministry of Tourism and Heritage. And within that, there was the mandate to balance between two critical components. Give me 10. Give me 10. All right? So, Your Excellency, how are we balancing that and how are we selling that as a way, going back to the point of the oasis, right? Because there's a sense of complacency. I've got something and I'm going to carry on with it. What's your take here and how might we capitalize on that in these sort of turmoils that we see around us?
I think the first part of answering your question has to do with how are we approaching the conservation of heritage within the Ministry of Heritage and Tourism. In the last 3 years, we've offered more than close to 30 heritage sites. These are other castles, forts, etc., to local community companies. Manage them in a way where an authentic experience could be presented at these sites. So today, major forts and castles are actually managed by local companies, companies that would have the ability to share stories about that area, stories historically known about that specific asset, and present an experience that is very much different because it is presented from within, as if you're visiting a family in their own house or home. What we do in the ministry is we make sure that this does not affect the commerciality of these assets, do not affect their very existence. So they are very strict conduct of what can be done, what cannot be done. The ministry would monitor carefully the safety of the building, the integrity of that site, and we believe that through this we could not only preserve this wealth of assets, but we would be able to present it to the rest of the world.
And Your Excellency, does this conflict with our idea of looking towards the future and trying to transit to the world's future? So, reconciling our past and achievements in the past with where we want to be in the future. Is that path a straight line or one that has some merges and divergence and convergence?
It would definitely be the later, but in fact, I think on the contrary, I think this is perfectly in alignment with where we want to head. Noting that some of these sites started using technology in better presenting what it used to be before, whether it's virtual reality, augmented reality, and other sorts of technologies, in order to give the visitor and the guest a glimpse of how was it
back when,
hundreds of years ago.
And I'm hoping though that some of our guests will experience some of those one way or the other. Thank you, Your Excellency. Creon, let me come to you and kind of flip the story of uncertainty as again creating. We've heard paranoia is one approach, and they're different, but I would imagine paranoia leads to anxiety, so we don't want that, right? But I'm thinking how we can turn those uncertainty in practical ways into competitive advantages as we look to position ourselves, whether it's for the local population and the migrant population and those who come invest, or to the rest of the world as well. What are your thoughts on that, and how might we do that?
Well, firstly, I think if you look historically, there are definitely situations where either countries or companies have taken advantage of major shocks. I was looking historically. Disraeli bought into the Suez Canal back in 1875 in the context of a major shock, and that then had subsequent major importance for the UK. But if you look today, we saw, for example, when Russia invaded Ukraine, there was an enormous shortage of energy in Europe, and there were opportunities for countries in the Gulf to supply replacement energy to Europe. And this is something that, in a sense, will be a kind of long-term solution to Europe's needs. It won't be something that Europe will go back
not a
to
stopgap
supply from Russia.
solution.
So in a way, there is an opportunity, and you need the flexibility and so on to respond to that.
But some might
on-
argue, Creon,
yeah.
that when you take those risks, you position yourself in a very awkward balance.
You do, and so I guess your question is, when to do it and when not to do it, and I think it roots back to, if you're looking at it from a country point of view, what your core advantages are. I think it's also just important to sort of take account. You can't always just appeal to an existing comparative advantage. You have sometimes to create new comparative advantages. But an opportunity may come along that enables you to do that. So again, just take an example in the UK. You look at London's financial centre now. Actually, the opportunity to create a big part of that financial centre came in the 1950s, 1960s, when the US put a constraint on the amount of interest that could be paid on dollar deposits in the US. And that was one of the things that gave a real boost to London and created what now is an enormous area of comparative advantage.
Is that comparative advantage still there after Brexit, for example, or has that?
So, interestingly, it is. I mean, I'd expected that London's capabilities would be much more affected by Brexit than has turned out to be the case. In fact, if you look at the number of jobs in London, it's something like 35% above the pre-pandemic level.
Okay.
And actually, in terms of trade in services and financial services, London is doing much better. So actually,
what did they do differently to capitalize?
this is something researchers are looking at. I mean, one of
Okay.
the factors may be that this extent of integration in Europe is less than perhaps people thought, and indeed it's now one of the priorities for the European Union in the context of the global uncertainty created by Donald Trump to double down on the efforts to create a single European financial market.
Right.
So that was one of the factors that may have played into it. The benefit of being in Europe in that area was not as great as people thought. Obviously, in other areas, we can see the costs that the UK has faced.
Right. That's an interesting. I was thinking of the island analogy, and kind of being isolated from Europe, and at least one would have thought services would not be affected in the same way. But thanks for that, Creon. Professor, just on your final thoughts, because I'm given the wording for 5 minutes. Experimentation is something that scares a lot of us. And we always want to ring fence and sandbox. What kind of approaches might we manage risks by, calculated or otherwise, when we think about experimentation, especially when we talk about policy and sort of thing? And what are the pitfalls to avoid over experimentation or the lack of taking decisions and just, experiments are sufficient, but they cannot be applied in the real world?
Well, policy experimentation is a really interesting way of looking at, and particularly for countries like Oman. It's interesting, and I think this question of experimentation and how much you can do it and you are able to stretch the border of your thinking, in terms of policy and politicians in such a country, it's also shaped by the way you look at your past and you look at your future, and how much, and it's, I would say in some ways, it's also almost more complex for countries where the legacy is positive, You're talking about traditions, heritage. That's a wonderful legacy in this country. But, if I work, for example, in a country like Finland, the legacy wasn't great. So they needed to do something and to engage more with the future because you had to overcome in some ways that kind of legacy. And the way they started doing it is actually via policy experimentation. And countries like Costa Rica, countries like Singapore, small countries which are, and I think it's very important ways to think, how do you build on your legacy, but without being dragged, that in your past, which could be great or not so great, and how much do you engage into the future and basically playing back and forth with different timelines and time horizon in that space, and also keeping in mind always that the past is a very poor predictor for the future. So definitely, I think, go for policy experimentation. It's easier said than done,
Sure.
because exactly all the questions, we're talking about the psychological safety, which, if you do what everybody does and you get it wrong, no problem. If you fail by doing something very original, well, that might cost your job. So, you have to create this kind of safe spaces, but intrapreneurship in terms of government. You have interesting and very good examples of how you can make, policy and governance at the country level much more agile, so that you can have this kind of experimentation.
And I like that agility point, because that kind of brings us to a nice end to thinking about managing risks and calculated. Dear panelists, perhaps we'll start with you, Kiran. Any last thoughts on how we should think about moving forward?
Yeah, maybe I could just take an issue with the panel we had before. I couldn't help doing this.
By all means, please do.
I do think that the actions the US have taken in the last couple of months is a fundamental change from the pattern of uncertainty up to then. And the reason for that is the US is right at the heart of the global system that was created after the Second World War. And in a sense, they seem to be saying, we're going to pull out from the economic space and from the security space to some extent.
To some extent, sure.
And that, to me, means that the rest of us have to think much more actively about what we're going to do. Does somebody step in to try and sort of preserve that global system? Will it be the EU? Will it be China, or some combination of them? But I think there is really a very fundamental question we now face that we hadn't faced up until this point.
Absolutely.
And in terms of the implications for Oman and for the investment framework, to some extent, the choices some of the big blocs make, whether China, your EU, or the CPTPP, the Asian bloc, about that will be really critical for the environment you face. I hope they do step in and say we want to preserve that system, notwithstanding the US decision.
Or improve it, perhaps, perhaps.
Or improve it, because in a sense, with the US out, you may be able to do things that you couldn't previously do.
Absolutely.
Exactly right.
Absolutely. Thanks for that, Kiran. Your Excellency, any last thoughts on, it doesn't have to be tourism or heritage? You may
No, maybe from the point just mentioned, I think the approach we are taking in the ministry is to try and diversify as much as we can. So we are diversifying where we market to make sure that the risk is as well distributed. We are focusing on the regional market as much as we can for all sorts of objectives, including climate-related objectives.
Absolutely.
And most importantly, we're trying to embrace agility as an approach. I mean, if you'll never know if it works or not until you try it out. And I think the margin at which we can afford in order to try out things is growing as uncertainty has become a fact of life nowadays.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Professor, any final thoughts?
Well, my last word for this in this panel would be about education. That's something I'm doing, and we heard that. I mean, and education in terms of vocational training, but also education altogether. I did my PhD in AI 25 years ago, and now people remember that I did that now because it's again on the front line. Well, what I'm trying to do when I'm working with executives, with public affairs, civil servants, it's how to engage with uncertainty, how to bring, comfort, and how to see and be a bridger in between, different perspectives. And I think if you have that plus critical thinking, you can go a long way, in the way you can do policies in countries like Oman.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much.
And that kind of, Professor, gives me the idea that leaders are becoming facilitators more so than just leading in terms of direction. But one of the things we didn't pay enough attention to in our panel, and I hope this comes up later, is climate action as well, because that's part of the mix. We know it's a transparent risk, as mentioned earlier, if I may borrow from that quote, and I think those are some of the things we need to be mindful as we think about investment, and Oman has positioned itself squarely in the middle of this in its net zero 2050 direction. Again, I would like all of you to join me in thanking my fellow panelists. Thank you very much for your thoughts. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you.